For 14 years, Debra Skiles was a ghost in the halls of Page Global. To the world, and especially to CEO Randy Page, she was the coffee girl, a nameless fixture in a blue polo who scrubbed marble and vanished before the important people arrived. But Debra carried a secret heavier than her cleaning bucket. She was the estranged daughter of the company's silent founder, holding the controlling shares in a trust he left behind to protect the firm from men exactly like Randy. When Randy moves to sell the company to a predatory firm that will gut the workforce, Debra sheds her anonymity. In a stunning boardroom reversal, she trades her latex gloves for a power suit, revealing that the woman who once cleaned Randy's desk now owns it. For 14 years, Debra Skiles had been invisible. Not the kind of invisible you choose. The kind the world decides for you when you're holding a rag instead of a pen. Story opens in the sterile, high-altitude silence of the Page Global executive floor. We see Debra on her knees, the damp heat of the cleaning water seeped into her skin as she scrubs a coffee ring off Italian marble. Above her, Randy Page strides past, his handmade leather shoes clicking with an authority that doesn't acknowledge her existence as human, only as an obstacle to be stepped around. The air smells of expensive cologne and corporate indifference. In the break room, the clock hits 5. Debra wraps her swollen wrists in the same frayed athletic tape she's used since the first year, held together by grit and the quiet knowledge of who she actually is. When a younger staffer suggests she ask for a better brace, Debra simply smiles. She knows that in this building, asking is a weakness, and silence is her greatest weapon. The morning light at Page Global didn't shine. It reflected off glass and steel, cold and unforgiving. Debra Skiles moved through it like a shadow. For 14 years, she had polished the same desks and filled the same carafes, becoming part of the architecture. Her uniform was a dull blue polo that signaled service, a garment that rendered her face unreadable to the titans of industry she served. At 5 a.m., she knelt on the cold floor of the boardroom. Her knees popped, a familiar dull protest. She didn't look up when Randy Page walked in, his phone pressed to his ear, barking orders about trimming the fat. To him, she was a furniture extension. She caught the scent of his espresso and the sharp metallic tang of his greed. Debra squeezed her sponge, the dirty water a stark contrast to his pristine white cuffs. She had memorized every password he'd typed and every secret he'd whispered into that phone. He thought he was alone in the room. He didn't realize that the coffee girl was actually the gatekeeper of his empire, waiting for the one moment where being invisible would finally allow her to be seen. The antiseptic bite of the hospital room always smelled of failure to Debra, a sharp contrast to the expensive mahogany and jasmine that defined her father's life. Arthur Skiles lay small against the white sheets, the man who had built Page Global from a sketch on a napkin now reduced to the erratic rhythm of a heart monitor. He had been the silent partner, the architect in the shadows, who let Randy Page's father take the spotlight while he engineered the company's integrity. Their estrangement had lasted a decade, fueled by Debra's refusal to enter a world she viewed as a gilded cage. But in those final hours, the silence between them finally broke. Arthur's hand, papery and trembling, reached for hers. He didn't offer an apology for the years of coldness. Instead, he offered a burden. He spoke of a secret trust, a fail-safe he had spent 40 years weaving into the company's legal bedrock. "Randy, boy doesn't have his father's heart," Arthur had whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "He sees people as numbers to be subtracted. He will try to burn it all down for a paycheck." He had pressed a heavy brass key into her palm, his eyes burning with a sudden, final lucidity. He told her that he had left his controlling interest not to a board, but to her, hidden under a layer of corporate veils that only she could lift. "Don't just inherit it, Debra," he had urged, his grip tightening with a strength that surprised her. "See it. Know what you're saving before you step into the light. Go in through the back door. Learn the names of the people who actually make the gears turn." It was a debt disguised as a legacy. He wanted her to save the soul of the firm, but he knew she wouldn't do it for the money. She would only do it if she saw the human cost of the alternative. When the monitor finally flatlined, Debra didn't call a lawyer. She didn't head to the penthouse. She went to a thrift store, bought a pair of sturdy work boots, and applied for a night shift cleaning position under her mother's maiden name. She had spent 14 years paying that debt in sweat and invisibility, waiting for the moment the silent partner's daughter would have to speak. The brass key remained on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her blue service polo, a cold reminder that the floor she scrubbed was, by divine right and legal decree, hers. The scent of expensive steam rose from the industrial espresso machine in the executive lounge, a cloying, heavy aroma that usually signaled the start of a grueling double shift. Debra moved with the practiced, rhythmic silence of a shadow, her microfiber cloth dancing across the mahogany surfaces of the outer office. Inside the inner sanctum, the door was slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of light and the jagged edge of Randy Page's voice to cut through the quiet. He was in high spirits, the kind of manic energy he only displayed when someone else was about to lose everything. Debra leaned into her work, her movements appearing mindless as she moved toward the executive suite's threshold. Through the gap, she could see Randy reclining in his high-backed chair, his feet, those same leather shoes that had kicked her bucket, resting on a desk that had once belonged to her father. Opposite him sat a man in a charcoal suit, a fixer whose name Debra knew only from the shredded documents she had painstakingly reconstructed over the years. "The board is already salivating over the merger figures," Randy said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial purr. "They don't realize that the surplus they're seeing is actually the liquidated pension reserves. By the time the ink is dry on the deal with Blackwood Equity, the fund will be a hollow shell." The fixer chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "And the employees? There are 3,000 people in the regional offices alone who have their entire futures tied to that fund." Randy dismissed them with a flick of his wrist. "They're overhead, Marcus. Legacy costs. In 48 hours, I'll have a $90 million exit bonus, and Blackwood will declare the pension plan insolvent as part of the restructuring. It's a clean break. The workers will get a few months of severance if they're lucky, but Page Global as we know it will be gone. I'm moving to the Caymans. I don't intend to be here when the lights go out." Debra's hand tightened around the handle of her spray bottle until her knuckles turned a ghostly white. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a blueprint. She looked down at the brass key hidden beneath her polo, feeling its cold weight against her skin. Randy wasn't just selling a company. He was stealing the dignity of the very people who had spent decades building the marble floors she now scrubbed. The coffee girl stood perfectly still, the steam from the lounge behind her feeling like a rising tide. She had seen enough. The invisibility that had been her sanctuary for 14 years was now her greatest tactical advantage, and the clock on Randy Page's empire had just begun to strike midnight. The air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of unearned triumph and the sharp, acidic tang of industrial cleaner. It was the eve of the signing, and Randy Page had summoned the board for a late-night final review. Debra moved through the peripheral shadows of the room, her presence as unremarkable as the air conditioning hum. She was carefully replenishing the water carafes, her ears catching the jagged edges of their conversation, the casual discussion of lives to be upended and pensions to be pillaged. As she reached Randy's seat at the head of the table, her gloved hand trembled just slightly, a rare fracture in her 14-year mask. A single bead of condensation from the pitcher escaped, landing squarely on the corner of the leather-bound Blackwood Equity proposal. It was a microscopic error, a temporary dampness on a document that was already a stain on the company's history. Randy's reaction was instantaneous and violent. He didn't just snap, he erupted. He slammed his hand onto the table, the sound like a gunshot in the hushed room, causing the other board members to jump. "For God's sake," he roared, his face flushing a mottled purple. He stood up, towering over Debra, his shadow swallowing her small frame. "Look at this. 14 years and you still can't perform the simplest task without fumbling like a terminal idiot." The room went silent, a heavy, awkward stillness. None of the directors looked at Debra. They looked at their watches, their tablets, their fingernails, anywhere but at the human being dismantled in front of them. Randy grabbed the pitcher from her hand, his fingers bruising her wrist as he shoved it back toward her chest. "You are a drain on this company's resources, Debra, a relic of a sentimental era we are finally, thank God, leaving behind," he sneered, his voice loud enough to echo in the hallway. You're lucky I haven't replaced you with a machine that actually knows how to pour water. Clean this up and get out. You're invisible for a reason, try to stay that way. Debra took the pitcher back, her head bowed low. She felt the heat of his breath on her forehead and the stinging cold of the spilled water on her hands. But beneath the facade of the broken servant, something shifted. The bitterness she had carried for her father's world was suddenly cauterized by a pure, white-hot clarity. She wasn't just staying to watch him, she was staying to bury him. She didn't offer an apology. She simply knelt, wiped the water from the table with a clean cloth, and walked out. As the door clicked shut behind her, she didn't feel small. She felt heavy with the weight of the crown she was about to take back. The transformation began not in a high-end salon, but in the gritty, fluorescent-lit sanctuary of the basement locker room at 4 a.m. Debra Skiles stood before a dented metal mirror, peeling off the sweat-stained blue polo that had been her second skin for 14 years. She dropped it into the trash bin, a ritualistic shedding of the coffee girl persona. For over a decade, she had hidden her shape, her intellect, and her heritage behind that polyester shroud. Now, the air of the locker room felt different against her skin. It felt like the morning of a revolution. From a garment bag hidden in a disused cleaning supply crate, she withdrew her armor. It wasn't just clothing, it was a statement of reclamation. The suit was a deep, midnight charcoal, tailored with lines so sharp they looked surgical. As she stepped into the trousers and buttoned the crisp white shirt, the ache in her back seemed to stiffen into a spine of steel. She replaced the frayed, athletic tape on her wrists with a pair of heirloom cufflinks that had once belonged to her father. Heavy gold weights that tethered her to a legacy Randy Page thought he had buried. Next came the documents. She retrieved the encrypted drive from the floor wax canister and laid out the physical backups she had spent the night printing in a darkened Kinko's across town. The paper felt heavy, embossed with the seals of the Skiles Family Trust and the original articles of incorporation. At the top of the stack sat the death certificate of Randy's career, the ironclad proof that 51% of Page Global's voting shares belonged to her. She slid them into a sleek leather portfolio, the zipper closing with a sound as final as a guillotine. She spent a moment on her hair, unbraiding the tight, functional plaits she wore for work and allowing her hair to frame her face in a sophisticated, commanding bob. She looked at the woman in the mirror and barely recognized her. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a cold, luminous clarity. She wasn't a servant looking for a handout. She was a sovereign coming to collect a debt. As she walked toward the service elevator for the last time, she didn't hit the basement button. She pressed P for penthouse. The ascent was silent, the numbers glowing on the panel like a countdown. She adjusted her lapels, checked the weight of the portfolio in her hand, and waited for the doors to open. The coffee girl was dead. The owner had arrived. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom didn't creak. They parted with a silent, expensive glide that usually announced a person of immense consequence. Randy Page was mid-sentence, his gold fountain pen hovering inches above the signature line of the Blackwood equity contract. "The vote is unanimous," he was saying, his voice thick with the oily satisfaction of a man moments away from a $90 million betrayal. "Let the record show that Page Global has." He stopped. The pen didn't hit the paper. Every head at the table turned toward the entrance, but they didn't see a woman in a blue service polo. They saw a figure in midnight charcoal, a silhouette of such sharp, tailored authority that the air in the room seemed to lose its oxygen. Debra walked toward the head of the table, her heels striking the marble with the steady, rhythmic finality of a gavel. "You're late with the refreshments," Randy snapped, his brain failing to reconcile the high-fashion armor with the face he had spent 14 years ignoring. He looked back at his papers, his face flushing with habitual irritation. "And you're out of uniform. Get out and send in someone who knows how to follow a dress code." Debra didn't turn back. She didn't flinch. She reached the head of the table and stood directly opposite him. She didn't pull out a chair. She waited for the silence to become unbearable. "The dress code has changed, Randy," Debra said. Her voice wasn't the soft, accented whisper of the coffee girl. It was a resonant, cultured strike that commanded the room. "And as for being late, I'd say I've arrived exactly when the majority shareholder is required." A nervous titter went around the table, but Randy's face went a sickly shade of gray. Is this a joke? Who do you think you are? Debra didn't answer with words. She reached into her leather portfolio and slid a single, notarized document across the polished wood. It came to rest directly over the Blackwood contract, obscuring the signature line. Randy looked down at the embossed seal of the Skiles Family Trust and the name written in bold, unmistakable script, Debra Skiles Washington, executrix and primary stakeholder. I'm the person who's been cleaning up your messes for 14 years, she said, leaning forward until she was inches from his face, her father's gold cufflinks catching the light. But today, I'm the person stopping you from making one more. Put the pen down, Randy. You're sitting in my chair. The board members sat frozen, their pens suspended, as the power in the room shifted so violently it felt physical. The woman who had been part of the furniture had just become the architect of their futures. Randy gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles white as the marble Debra used to scrub. This is a fabrication, he hissed, his voice cracking beneath the weight of the room's sudden, suffocating silence. You're a janitor. You found some old papers in a bin and thought you could play at being a queen. Security. Debra didn't move. She didn't have to. The security team, men she had greeted by name every morning at 4 a.m. while Randy was still asleep, remained stationed at the door, their faces like stone. She reached into her portfolio and withdrew a second set of documents, bound in the heavy blue cardstock of a forensic audit. Security isn't coming for me, Randy. They're here to ensure you don't leave with anything that doesn't belong to you, Debra said, her tone as cool and precise as a winter morning. She began to pace the length of the table, the rhythmic click of her heels punctuating the air like a death toll. 14 years is a long time to watch a man steal. I didn't just clean your office. I cleaned up your trail. I have the logs of the offshore transfers to the Blackwood Shell accounts. I have the forged signatures on the pension liquidation orders. And most importantly, I have the testimony of the invisible people you spoke in front of because you thought they were part of the furniture. She stopped behind Randy's chair, leaning down so the board could see the contrast between his frantic sweating and her absolute composure. You didn't just betray the company, you betrayed my father's name. You treated Page Global like a carcass to be picked clean, and you treated the people who built it like the dirt on your shoes. One by one, the board members, men who had laughed at Randy's jokes only an hour ago, began to slide their copies of the merger agreement away from them. The predatory deal was dead, and they could feel the predator in the room had changed. The trust dictates that upon proof of gross fiduciary negligence, the CEO is to be removed with immediate effect, Debra stated, her voice echoing with the authority of the throne she had finally claimed. You are stripped of your title, your stock options, and your access to this building. You'll find your personal items in a cardboard box at the service entrance. I believe you know where that is. Randy looked around the table, searching for a single ally, but he found only the cold, judgmental stares of peers who smelled blood in the water. He stood up, his movements jerky and humiliated, realizing that the woman he had called a terminal idiot had played a game he wasn't even aware was happening. As he was led out by the guards, Debra didn't watch him go. She was already looking at the head of the table, her hand resting on the mahogany desk, finally reclaiming the space that had always been hers. The silence in the boardroom was no longer cold. It was expectant. Debra stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling gray grid of the city she had spent 14 years watching from the basement. The morning sun finally broke through the haze, bathing the executive floor in a warm, golden light that felt like an absolution. She reached up and unlatched the heavy brass key from the chain around her neck, setting it gently upon the mahogany desk. It was no longer a hidden weight. It was a cornerstone. Her first act was not to call a press conference or review the stock tickers. Instead, she pressed the intercom button, the one Randy had used to bark orders for more cream and less noise. "Send them up," she said, her voice steady and clear. Minutes later, the heavy doors opened again. This time, it wasn't a parade of suits. It was the night shift cleaning crew, led by a woman named Sarah who had worked alongside Debra for a decade. They stood on the plush carpet, shifting uncomfortably in their blue polos, eyes wide as they took in the view they were usually only allowed to see through the bottom of a mop bucket. Debra walked toward them, not as a master, but as a peer who had finally come home. "For 14 years, this company treated you like ghosts," Debra said, looking Sarah directly in the eye. "My father, Arthur Skiles, believed that the people who maintain the foundation are as important as the people who sit at the top. Today, we return to that belief." She announced the immediate dissolution of the Blackwood deal and the permanent securing of the pension fund. But more importantly, she announced the creation of a new internal oversight board, one made up of the service staff, the invisible eyes and ears of the company, to ensure that no man like Randy Page could ever operate in the shadows again. As she promoted Sarah to director of operations for the facility, Debra felt the final remnants of her bitterness dissolve. She walked back to the head of the table and sat down. For the first time in 14 years, she didn't feel like a ghost in a machine. She looked at the portrait of her father hanging in the foyer, his silent partner's smile appearing a little brighter in the morning sun. She had saved the soul of the firm by walking through the back door, and as she picked up a pen to sign the new corporate charter, she did so not as a cleaner, and not just as an owner, but as a Skiles. The view from the top was finally clear. "I have completed the narrative arc for Debra Skiles,"